The year is 2011. After 8 bloody years, the Iraq War is declared over, as coalition troops return home. In Pakistan, after a decade-long manhunt, US Special Forces eliminate the architect of 9/11, Osama bin Laden. In Libya, long-standing pariah state and terrorism sponsor, the civil war ends with Colonel Gaddafi being captured and killed. And a domino effect of popular anti-authoritarian movements sweeps across North Africa and the Middle East, demanding greater freedoms and toppling dictators in what would become known as the Arab Spring. The Obama administration is working steadily to improve its relations with its old Cold War adversary as part of their Russia reset, producing a renewed nuclear arms limitation treaty which came into force in February. Whilst the UK government was similarly reaching out to China, hosting a bilateral trade-focused summit in June. Shortly before Christmas, Kim Jong-il, the dear leader responsible for arming the rogue nation North Korea with nukes, dies. It seemed then, through a mixture of dragon slaying and diplomacy, the world was potentially on course for a new, more peaceful age. Except, not so much. Because behind the headlines, the eternal war in the shadows was as fierce as ever, and was also evolving in unpredictable and in some cases alarming new directions. The traditional elements of these clandestine struggles, espionage, sabotage, assassination, psyops, were being reshaped by new technologies, where high-value targets could be struck down by drones from above at the press of a button, and where cyberspace was becoming the new domain in which intelligence would now be gathered, or in which acts of sabotage would now be carried out. The deaths of bin Laden, Gaddafi and others was also very far from being the death of terrorism, because the identity of the typical terrorist was changing, with right-wing domestic extremists and lone wolf attacks on the rise. Counter-terrorism too had evolved, becoming more preemptive in a way that promised new tools to foil terror plots in their incipient stages, but which could also have worrying implications for personal freedoms and privacy. In this episode, we look at the changing face of covert and counter-intelligence activities post 9/11 in general, and at the key crossroads of the early 2010s in particular, and also at how popular fiction examined some of these developments in the same period. We'll examine the accuracy of how modern covert ops has been depicted in fiction in recent decades, and the favouritism given to pre-digital era settings for espionage stories. Have spies, assassins, and other human elements of traditional clandestine operations become obsolete in the 21st century? Let's find out. Welcome once more to Quantum Geek. Spies, spycraft and assorted spy tings have been with us since way back when. In ancient China, Sun Tzu was saying, "One who knows the enemy and knows himself will not be endangered in 100 engagements." In ancient Athens, fear of enemy spies was such that the default penalties for treason were either execution or otherwise having your hand cut off and buried in a particular type of shaming soil, they reserved especially for the most bellendy of all Athenian bellends. Even the Mongols, who we tend to think of as just beardy equestrian psychos who charged at stuff screaming, in reality made extensive use of espionage in their military planning. Spies could of course provide useful intel by simply observing troop movements or overhearing tavern gossip, but better still if you could gain access to your opponent's messages. As Varys, a medieval spy master in Game of Thrones, tells us, the contents of a man's letters could be much more valuable than the contents of a man's purse. Such messages can reveal the vulnerabilities of both individuals and states, secrets, tactical or technological. To maintain the ability to communicate with your allies and agents, whilst guarding against your communiques being intercepted by your enemies, governments needed a way to make the messages unintelligible to anyone but the intended recipients, thus creating the world of codes and ciphers. And once you have codes, of course, then you need code breakers. Elizabeth I's spymaster Francis Walsingham pioneered this area, notably in his intricate game of cryptographic chess with Elizabeth's wannabe usurper cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, eventually tricking her into incriminating herself when messages she thought were beyond his reach were intercepted and exposed. Eventually, as we reach the 20th century, new technologies would revolutionise communication and also create a whole new branch of espionage. The telegraph and subsequently radio allowed near instantaneous global messaging, but raised the spectre of new ways in which your secrets could be stolen. Whilst pre-electronic espionage was one way or another all down to human agents or human intelligence, abbreviated in modern parlance to HUMINT, this new field of signals intelligence, or SIGINT, rested on newfangled machines. As in Tudor times, Old Blighty was once again at the forefront in these early days of SIGINT. The communications needs of the Empire had compelled Britain to embrace telegraphy, and they became the dominant force in the telegraph network. When the First World War broke out, the Royal Navy cut Germany's undersea telegraph cables, forcing the Germans to either use the British telegraph network instead or to switch to communicating by radio. Either way, Britain could intercept their messages. In the interwar period, cryptography became exponentially more sophisticated owing to new cipher machines, the most famous of these being the German Enigma machine. As dramatised in 2014's The Imitation game, it was British SIGINT endeavours at Bletchley Park, codenamed Ultra, which, utilising the proto-computer Colossus, that gave the Allies a significant advantage during World War II, arguably being a key component in eventual victory over Nazi Germany. After the war concluded, many of the same personnel and equipment continued straight over into the new SIGINT cat-and-mouse game with the West's new enemy, the USSR. There are several significant advantages in stealing your opponent's secrets across cyberspace, instead of with field agents, or instead of attacking through force of arms. Physical attacks, especially if there are civilian casualties, risk producing both immediate retaliation but also a rally round the flag effect, strengthening their morale and giving their governments a greater mandate to act aggressively to your side in the long term. Conversely, being cyber-attacked tends to make you look instead weak and incompetent, undermining both public confidence in institutions and leaders. Cyber agents, because they are physically on a different part of the planet from the secrets they are stealing, are not subject to the risks of capture, which can then lead in turn to the captured agent being coerced into giving your secrets to the enemy or becoming a diplomatically embarrassing liability and a source of damaging political leverage. Even when intrusions or attacks are detected, the fog of cyber war dispersing your digital wake across global networks often makes it difficult to pinpoint with a beyond reasonable doubt level of certainty where said attack has come from. This therefore gives state actors enhanced deniability, or indeed even presents opportunity to stitch up third parties in a false flag kind of deal. Hacking in cyberspace began to emerge into popular media in the 1980s, most notably in the 1983 film WarGames, in which a teenage hacker inadvertently infiltrates the US nuclear missile command. Other early cinematic offerings on the topic leaned heavily on the glitz, glamour or gimmicks to make the arcane and technical subject matter more appealing to the average moviegoer. Tron opted to make effectively cyber war look and feel the same as regular warfare, with the characters engaged in chases and firefights in a sci-fi magical battlefield. 90s and early noughties movies like Sneakers, The Net, Hackers and Swordfish meshed the corporate and criminal worlds with the intergovernmental machinations, generally while keeping their dramatis personae conspicuously hip and sexy. In truth though, a lot of this was, in broad strokes, accurate. Given late Gen Xers and millennials were the first to grow up with computers, hackers were invariably on the young side. WarGames actually had such an impact on President Reagan when he watched it that he issued the first presidential directive on computer security the following year. In 1999, 15-year-old Jonathan James would penetrate the computer systems of the US Department of Defense and NASA, and international state rivalries would frequently intersect with corporate espionage. A Chinese hacking program that took place across the mid-noughties, codenamed Titan Rain by the US intelligence community, primarily focused on the defense contractors, helping themselves to a hecton of digital bounty before any kind of effective coordinated defense was mounted. And hackers frequently do still operate in loosely affiliated cells, independent of their national governments, state-sponsored or enabled, but still enough at arm's length to maintain that sweet plausible deniability. This approach has been used by most major and cyber-savvy nations, but has particularly been embraced by Russia. Cyber attacks can go way beyond simply stealing state or corporate secrets. The integration of computer networks and components into every part of national infrastructure and our daily lives has opened the way for cyber espionage to be complemented by cyber sabotage. 2007's fourth installment in the Die Hard franchise, Live Free or Die Hard, Die Hard 4.0 to European audiences, portrays a terrorist group inflicting what the film calls a fire sale on the United States, attacking its transport, financial and power grid systems in rapid succession, at the same time as terrorising the public by taking control of news channels. In a case of life imitating art, this is very similar to what happened to the Baltic state of Estonia only a month or so before the film's release, with banking systems and government websites disabled nationwide and website landing pages ominously replaced with the former flag of the Soviet Union. The attack was, apparently, a retaliation for the resiting of a divisive World War II commemorative statue to a less prominent location, a statue seen by most Estonians as a reminder of the former Soviet occupation of their country, but by Estonia's Russian minority and the Kremlin as a patriotic symbol of the Russian victory over the Nazis.
A hacktivist wing of the Putin fanboy group Nashi claimed responsibility for the attacks, and regardless of whether in fact they were the main instigator, this is a prime example of the handy patriotic hacker narrative that Moscow could use to deny direct responsibility, at the same time as celebrating the episode as a victory for Russian nationalism. In fact, Die Hard 4 is also plausible, not a sentence I ever thought would come out of my mouth, with regards to the backstory of its main antagonist, the cyber-terrorist mastermind Thomas Gabriel. In the film, Gabriel is a former Department of Defense IT analyst, has repeatedly tried to warn his government about the risks of a wide-scale cyber attack against America, but whose calls to arms are humiliatingly dismissed by his superiors, including Tuvok out of Star Trek Voyager. I mean, come on, Tuvok, logic, security, you should be all over this. This was pretty much exactly what happened to corporate IT analyst and subsequent whistleblower Sean Carpenter. In the noughties, Carpenter was assigned by his employer, the defence contractor Sandia, to investigate what they thought to be a handful of unrelated IT breaches. But in the process, he uncovered the aforementioned massive cyber espionage campaign, Titan Reign. When he tried to pass this up the chain, his concerns were dismissed. He then started his own off-the-books counter-hacking campaign, ultimately discovering the Chinese origins of Titan Reign. When he attempted to report this to his superiors, he was savagely berated and sacked. China was smart to attack the private sector, who had traditionally been seen cybersecurity as an overhead they could do without, and were always reluctant to report this to the government, for fear of what public knowledge of a cyber attack could do to their share values. Unsettling as the 2007 attack was for Estonians, an enthusiastic early adopter of the internet and digital age, the disruption only actually lasted a few weeks, and in the aftermath NATO founded a joint cyber defence centre based in the Estonian capital Tallinn. In the wake of Titan Reign incursions, the US has been taking cybersecurity more seriously since the mid-noughties, and in a similar fashion to the real-world military WarGames, instigated a regular defence exercise called Cyberstorm, which has continued to be run every other year since. A full gloves-off cluster hacks cybertage Die Hard 4 style fire sale by one major global power against another therefore seems a bit fanciful, not only because defences have become more robust, but because it would likely invite massive retaliation. At least that will probably apply during peacetime, but in a situation where nations are already involved in direct military conflict, going all in and striking simultaneously across cyberspace as well as on the battlefield starts to look like an obvious gambit, debilitating, obstructing or otherwise bamboozling your opponent as you steamroller over their crippled defences. An on-screen imagining of this scenario is how the Cylons stitch up the human race in the noughties reboot of Battlestar Galactica. Whilst in the 1970s original version the genocidal Cylon attack was simply a military ambush amid peace talks, in the 2004 opener the Cylons have co-opted public intellectual, computer scientist and useful idiot Gaius Baltar to covertly insert a computer virus into the software of the human space fleet. When the Cylons rock up in orbit, the 12 colonies of Kobol are swiftly annihilated as the human Battlestars and Vipers are paralysed by a cyber attack. Only Galactica, the clunky old sort of Windows 95 dial-up workhorse of the Battlestar fleet, is left unscathed. In the real world, again we can see parallels with Russian tactics, who have launched their most audacious cyber offences as just one prong of a military attack. Their invasion of Georgia in 2008 was accompanied by attacks on government websites and disinformation campaigns to demoralise and disorient the Georgians. And there's even been some suggestion that an oil pipeline explosion that occurred just before the invasion might have been the result of a Russian cyber intrusion. Since 2015, Russia has repeatedly cyber-attacked Ukraine's power plants, disrupting infrastructure between or on top of military strikes. Given the apparent ability of 21st century nations to strike at each other remotely through cyberspace, modern spy fiction does seem to default somewhat anachronistically to showing agents having to physically infiltrate high-tech facilities or nab digital secrets via some physical medium. The electronic equivalent of the old-school stolen dossier or smuggled microfilm. One can compare the first and last of the Mission Impossible films in 1996 and 2025 respectively, and see how much of the plot resolves around a physical carrier or gizmo. The CD carrying the knock list in the OG film, and the thumb drive with the entity-killing computer virus in the concluding film. Whilst this undoubtedly comes largely from the tried and tested narrative formula of having some tangible artefact to drive characters' actions and motives, the archetypal MacGuffin, this idea is in fact not so out of date in the cyberspace age as one might initially assume. Reverse engineering or straight-up copy-pasting, advanced tech often remains preferable to stealing the underlying designs or IP piecemeal. Through the noughties and into the early 2010s, Russian asset Alexander Fishenko spent years smuggling advanced military microchips out of the US and back to his homelands through his fake electronics company. In practice, many of the more critical systems, military or civilian in any country, will likely be air-gapped, unconnected to the World Wide Web or wider computer networks. One of modern history's most successful cyber attacks did therefore actually play out much like a Mission Impossible set piece, with a covert agent infiltrating a high-security complex, physically plugging a USB MacGuffin into an otherwise inaccessible computer system, nervously watching the clock as a poison pill uploaded, and then making his exit undetected. The agent in question was Dutch intelligence asset Eric van Saben, a contractor whose engineering credentials and Iranian spouse gained him access to the Natanz nuclear facility in Iran in 2008. The malware he uploaded was later dubbed Stuxnet and was a product of a covert US cyber program codenamed Operation Olympic Games, which spanned both the Bush and Obama administrations. Stuxnet gradually infiltrated the components that controlled Natanz's enrichment centrifuges, causing them to spin out of sync with each other, causing cascading and catastrophic damage to the equipment, ultimately disabling about 20% of Iran's enrichment equipment and setting back their nuclear program by years. Stuxnet came with quite the price tag, an estimated $1 billion to develop, but arguably a bargain compared to the escalating costs and economic fallout of the Trump administration's, let's say, less subtle methods of obstructing Iran's nuclear program. In addition to cyber warfare, military and covert ops had also started to overlap in the skies, in the form of drone warfare. The term drone is a bit of a lazy media catch-all. Really, any gizmo that can be steered remotely by a human being could be called a drone, from a bomb disposal unit to Amazon delivery bot to a Roomba. The drones we're specifically talking about here are more precisely called unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs. Experimental UAVs have been around in some form since the early 20th century, but only really became a regular fixture in intelligence and military activities at the start of the 21st century. UAVs offer many clear advantages over both human agents and human pilots, being cheaper and quicker to produce than a piloted aircraft, and avoiding the risks of death or capture that a human spy on the ground would otherwise be susceptible to. Starting with the death of the leader of the Yemeni wing of Al-Qaeda in 2002, over the coming decades UAVs would be, according to US government estimates, instrumental in eliminating 70% of Al-Qaeda's leadership in the decade that followed. Additionally, they played a crucial reconnaissance role, with UAVs also contributing to the surveillance that ultimately tracked down Osama bin Laden. By 2011, the airspace over Pakistan in particular had become a hotspot for US drone missions, with journalists' investigations estimating that drone strikes were occurring at a rate of 1 every 4 days by the summer of that year. And whilst hunting down and killing militant or terrorist leaders has been part of the portfolio of clandestine and intelligence services for decades, what would previously always been explicitly labelled assassination, this use of remote-controlled weapons to eliminate targets half a world away led to the coining of a new term: targeted killing. This idea, a bit like the term for the wider campaigns these drone strikes were part of, the War on Terror, represented a legal and ethical reframing of these assassinated high-value targets, asserting they were combatants on a global battlefield rather than criminals and terrorists who might otherwise face arrests and due process. Whilst the legal ins and outs of whether the rules of war or the rule of law should apply continue to be debated, it's certainly true that if this is a war on terror, it is a distinctly asymmetrical war. The United States possesses massive superiority in resources and technology versus any of the assorted anti-Western terrorist cells, and, tactically speaking, those groups' only feasible means of staying out of UAV crosshairs is for them to commingle the members and bases with civilians. This, in turn, of course, significantly increases the risk that civilians may be killed in any drone strikes, drawing both sides into that murkiest ethical quagmire of human shields, and potential exploitation of civilian deaths by terrorists as a rallying cry for recruitment. UAVs are often presented by their proponents as sophisticated tools that deliver precision strikes, but the level of precision has looked decidedly shaky in practice, as the often reported accidental killings of wedding parties would seem to testify. Such civilian casualties from drone strikes can therefore result in the phenomena known as blowback, where a superpower's covert or military operations ultimately further fan the flames of terrorism rather than reducing terrorism threats. as the technologically less well-equipped side in these asymmetrical conflicts is unable to effectively counter the threats of UAVs and can't directly hit back against the enemy combatants as the pilots are thousands of miles away, drone strikes have tended to inspire yet more retaliatory terrorism against the attacker's homeland. For example, the terrorist Faisal Shahzad specifically cited drone strikes as part of his motivation for his attempted bombing of Times Square in 2009. We see this scenario illustrated in the first season of Homeland, in which flashbacks show us how captured Marine Nicholas Brody was ultimately turned to Abu Nazir's jihadist cause, not by as much of torture, but instead due to witnessing an American drone strike on a school. A plot point that was probably inspired by the similar real-world strike on an Islamic seminary in Pakistan in 2006, in which Nazir's young son, who Brody has become a father figure to, is killed. And, whilst it probably wasn't intended as a commentary on the plight of terrorist cells, the prevalence of drone strikes in the news in the late noughties and early tens filtered through into the early storyboarding and production of the movie Oblivion, released in 2013, in which UAVs deployed by colonialist aliens are the main antagonists. Killing human fighters and civilians alike, unable to repel and evade the drones themselves, the Ragtag resistance is ultimately forced to take the fight back to the aliens' home turf, smuggling a nuclear bomb onto their orbiting space vessel, the Tet. On the other side of the equation, drone warfare can also take a more psychological toll on its operators and overseers. It's in Season 4 of Homeland, the show's main protagonist, CIA officer Carrie Matheson, has become the agency's station chief in Kabul. From there, she directs frequent drone strikes against Taliban HVTs, displaying increasingly dangerous detachment from both the reality of her missions and her own self-recrimination, aggressively dismissing the criticisms of a guilt-ridden drone pilot early in the season, and nearly allowing the collateral damage killing of her friend and mentor Saul later in the season, in a heat-of-the-moment, vengeance-driven order to launch a drone strike on a Taliban leader, only being restrained at the last second by her field agent colleague, Peter Quinn. In the final season, guilt finally catches up with Carrie as she finds herself standing by the graves of her drone strike former victims. Similarly, the late noughties film Body of Lies portrays Leonardo DiCaprio's CIA field agent as being the literally more grounded figure, distraught at the death of his fellow Iraqi-American agent and becoming romantically involved with a local nurse, whilst Russell Crowe's distant drone commander treats the lives of both enemies and assets with the same reckless indifference. Perhaps the most comprehensive deep dive on drone warfare from the perspective of those with a finger on the button is the film Eye in the Sky, the first screenplay of which was pitched in 2011, though it didn't actually get produced and released till the middle of the decade. Whilst Homeland, probably for dramatic purposes, oversimplifies the chain of command involved in a drone strike, more or less giving Carrie alone the decision-making agency to yay or nay it, Eye in the Sky more accurately conveys the complex array of globe-spanning personnel involved, from intelligence officers to the military, to the politicians and the lawyers. The movie highlights how drone strikes, or arguably counter-terrorism operations in general, can essentially be a modern-day aerial version of the trolley problem. Is it permissible to sacrifice a single or small number of innocent lives in order to then save a much larger number? The film's main protagonist, a drone commander colonel played by Helen Mirren, possesses the same ruthless single-mindedness as Carrie in Homeland Season 4, but is constrained by both legal considerations and mathematical determinations around the CDE, collateral damage estimate. When a young girl strays into the blast radius of their drone crosshairs, Aaron Paul's everyman drone pilot who provides the film's empathetic heart stalls the strike by being all like, yo, for real, like Dame Helen Mirren, what the fuck? Meanwhile, Alan Rickman's senior general provides the hard-nosed utilitarian counterpoint, as the surveillance reveals that terrorist targets are about to launch a high-casualty suicide attack, reacting to the prevarications of his Cobra Committee colleagues by being all like, yo, for real, politicians and lawyers, what the fuck? So, whilst targeted killings may on one level simply be what we used to call assassinations rebranded, an argument could be made, therefore, that the UAV strikes have, in the short to medium term, actually brought a greater level of oversight to these extrajudicial killings. However, the sheer number of these strikes means even with a low CDE, the cumulative body count proves to be a grim statistic, and a potential rallying cry for the next generation of terrorists. It remains to be seen, then, whether the rapid proliferation of drones among other nations, particularly as a result of the Russia, Ukraine and Iran wars, whether such levels of oversight will be maintained.